In the closing years of the 19th century, London was a city of smoke and contrast, where polished carriages rattled past barefoot children and fortunes were made a few streets away from hunger. In the district of Clerkenwell, the streets narrowed into cramped alleys lined with brick tenements and corner shops, and among these worn facades, an entire world seemed to exist on its own. Here, families from Italy had settled in tight clusters, hanging their laundry above cobbled lanes and filling the air with the sounds of a language that did not belong to London and yet had grown roots in its stone. They called their little enclave Piccola Italia, Little Italy, a pocket of Catholic shrines, mission churches, coffee smells, and thick cooking steam that drifted up past broken chimneys. In one of those tall, tired houses on Little Bath Street, a child was born on the 11th of July 1888. Officially, on a piece of paper filed and forgotten in a registry office, he was named Octavio Hanley, the son of a laundress called Elizabeth Hanley. The space beside father remained blank, an empty silence on the page that matched the murmurs in the stairwells. In buildings where neighbours heard every footstep and argument, no secret stayed secret for long. People whispered that the boy's real father was not a mystery at all, but a young Italian waiter from Parma named Ottavio Sabini, a man who carried trays in West End restaurants and spent what little he had with too much charm and too little caution. Whether this story was true or embroidered with time hardly mattered. What did matter was that the boy grew up knowing he was different, that his very name was a question, and that in a district where family meant survival, he had to fight for his place. Elizabeth did everything she could to keep the two of them afloat. Day after day, her hands were submerged in cold water, scrubbing shirts and bedding for families only marginally better off than she was. When washing and mending weren't enough, she took in lodgers from the nearby printworks, men who came home with fingers stained in ink and pockets often disappointingly light. The corridor always smelled of damp fabric and coal dust. Money was scarce, and comfort was something other people seemed to have. Yet the boy watched his mother endure, and that lesson stayed with him longer than anything he ever learned in a classroom. Around 1898, the pattern of their lives shifted. The Italian waiter of rumour reappeared, no longer juggling plates in dining rooms, but working as a stonemason, his hands calloused from hammer and chisel rather than wine bottles. He and Elizabeth married, and with that marriage came a new shape to the boy's identity. The illegitimate Octavio Hanley became, in law and in the neighbourhood's eyes, part of the Sabini family. Over time, his given name softened into something more English, and he came to be known as Charles. Among locals, though, he soon acquired another name, entirely Darby. No one would later agree on where the nickname came from. Some said it was tied to the Derby races. Others claimed it was childhood teasing that simply stuck. What mattered was that in the crowded streets of Little Italy, if you spoke of Darby, people knew exactly which boy you meant. Clerkenwell, however, was not an easy place for any child to grow up. The narrow lanes were full of carts, stray dogs, and sharp-eyed men who measured others in seconds. Children learned quickly that a slow tongue could be more dangerous than quick fists, and that respect was rarely given without being taken first. Still, Elizabeth and her new husband tried to steer their son towards the limited respectability available to poor families. They enrolled him at Drury Lane Industrial School, a place designed for boys the authorities considered neglected, unruly, or simply inconvenient. Life there was ruled by bells and orders. Mornings began in the half-light, with boys dragged from bed to stand in neat lines. Marching drills, religious lessons, and manual training filled the day, all wrapped in a strictness meant to keep them from slipping into crime and the hard beds of prison cells later in life. After his time there, Charles was transferred to an elementary school in Holborn. On the attendance register, he became just another name, another child expected to sit still, recite lessons, and copy sums onto slates. The promise was clear: learn enough, and one day you might find work that did not break your body completely. but the pull of the streets outside the classroom windows was strong. Clerkenwell, with its noise and danger and possibility, always called him back. Lessons in geography could not compete with the living map of alleys and markets he knew by heart. By the age of 13, school and he had quietly parted ways. He stopped turning up and no one came looking very hard. The real teachers in his life became the pavements, the pubs, and the men who lived by their wits. Those streets taught him quickly. He learned how to hear trouble in the sudden hush of a doorway, how to spot a stranger who did not belong, and how to stand his ground without inviting a beating. He saw men who worked themselves to the bone for a few coins a week, and others who seemed always to have cash despite never clocking in anywhere. From his mother's side, he had learned endurance. From the neighborhood, he learned something just as important: that in a world stacked against you, loyalty to your own was the only safety net you had. If someone from Little Italy was insulted or cheated, you took it personally. If trouble came from outside, you stood together. That sense of us versus them, born in narrow stairwells and crowded churches, would shape every decision he made from then on. By 15, the household needed more income, and Darby stepped into the working world. His first job was as a messenger boy for a printing firm. Day after day, he darted through London's streets carrying proofs, letters, and small packages between offices and shops. It was tiring work, but it opened his eyes to parts of the city he had only glimpsed before. He saw how respectable men in good coats spoke politely in front of others and cruelly behind closed doors, how decisions made in quiet rooms rippled out to people who would never know the names of those responsible. He saw, in short, that power often wore a calm face. Later, he took a job as a billiard marker in a public house. The pay was little, but the education was invaluable. Standing beside the green tables night after night, he became invisible and yet noticed everything. He watched how men changed after 2 or 3 drinks, how friendly bets could turn into bitter arguments, and how pride made some people risk more than they could afford to lose. He learned how to smooth egos, how to disappear at the first sign of a real fight, and how to collect tips with a small, well-timed smile. The billiard room taught him that money and emotion were tied together in ways that could be exploited by anyone who understood them. Around this time, another door opened: the boxing gyms of Holborn and the nearby baths. On the surface, they were places of sport, sweat, and discipline. Beneath the surface, they were meeting points for a different kind of London. Former dock workers, hungry young brawlers, gamblers with sharp eyes, and men who were already starting to live by intimidation all flowed through those changing rooms and rings. Fights were sometimes staged behind locked doors, with cash exchanged in low voices and outcomes nudged by quiet understanding. Darby was not tall, and in a city that worshipped big men with heavy fists, that could have been a problem. But his build was solid and compact, his eyes intense, and when he chose to stand still and simply watch someone, it felt to them as though they were being weighed and measured. One promoter, Dan "Die" Sullivan, noticed this. He didn't need Darby in the ring, he needed him at the door. A doorman, in places like these, was more than a guard. He was the first test a visitor had to pass. Standing there in a plain suit, Darby discovered that he could turn men away with nothing more than a slow shake of his head, and that those who got inside understood it was because he had allowed it. Night after night, he watched the way boxing drew in more than fighters and fans. It drew in bookmakers, small-time lenders, and men who could calculate odds faster than most people could add. Bets were placed on punches, on rounds, on fighters' tempers. Arguments about who owed what were sometimes settled with fists, but more often with quiet, threatening conversations in corridors. Darby listened and learned. He began to understand that there were worlds in London where the law barely mattered, where what held everything together was fear, respect, and the promise that anyone who broke an unwritten rule would regret it. By his early 20s, he had become something more than just another boy from a poor Italian street. He was a watcher, a listener, and increasingly a man people did not want to cross. The tenements of Little Italy still claimed him as their own, but his horizon had widened. The smoky gyms, the noisy pubs, and the quiet, tense corners where money changed hands had become his environment. And beyond all of them, there was a bigger, brighter stage calling his name, the racecourses of southern England, where horses thundered past grandstands, crowds roared, and money moved in rivers. For a man like Darby Sabini, who understood both fear and opportunity, the racetrack would become the place where he stepped fully out of the shadows and began to build an empire. As the new century pushed forward, London entered a period of restless excitement. Trains carried crowds beyond the city limits, and the racecourses of southern England drew everyone from dock workers to aristocrats eager for the thrill of fast horses and faster money. People with nothing in common the rest of the week suddenly stood side by side at Epsom or Brighton, cheering the same animals and clutching betting slips that promised a few shillings more than their pockets held. And wherever crowds gathered, trouble was never far away. Darby Sabini had learned enough by now to understand that where men gathered to gamble, someone always ended up owing someone else, and those debts did not always wait to be settled politely. He was in his mid-20s when he began to appear regularly near the race rails, first as a spectator, then as a quiet associate of bookmakers who came to appreciate his ability to make problems disappear. Bookmakers in those days operated in a space that was only half regulated at best. They needed a measure of protection, not just from petty thieves who lurked among the crowd, but from rival gangs who saw the flow of cash as an invitation to take a share of the profits by force. Darby had already spent years observing men who lived by intimidation, and he began to apply those lessons with a patience that set him apart from the blustering enforcers who relied purely on violence. He discovered that he could earn more with a calm voice than others did with raised fists. At first, his work was simple. He and a handful of trusted acquaintances, most of them young Anglo-Italians he had known from Clerkenwell, offered to stand near bookmakers while wagers were made, keeping a quiet eye on problem drinkers or crooked pickpockets. If someone tried to cause trouble, a stare from Darby or a subtle movement of his men was often enough to convince the troublemaker that he had business elsewhere. The bookmakers paid small sums of gratitude, believing they were merely rewarding helpful behavior. But as the arrangement continued, the sums increased and a pattern began to form. Protection, even unofficial, had become a service, and Darby was very good at providing it. Slowly, the number of men around him grew. He chose them carefully, preferring those who understood that discipline could be more frightening than wild temper. Among them were Joe and Fred Sabini, likely cousins, and other young men who, like him, were caught between Italian heritage and London upbringing. Together, they travelled from one track to another: Brighton, Lewes, Hove, and later the more prestigious courses such as Hurst Park and Gatwick. Always dressed sharply, always calm, never loud enough to attract official suspicion. They were noticed, certainly, but not by policemen first, by bookmakers who realized that avoiding robbery and harassment was worth paying for. What began with polite offers of help soon developed into something firmer. Bookmakers learned that refusing payment was unwise. Darby rarely needed to threaten directly. Those who hesitated would find someone else approaching them later with a softer reminder. A bookmaker might be told it would be unfortunate if a misunderstanding occurred next week. The message was plain enough: most paid without argument. With the money that came in, Darby began investing quietly back in Clerkenwell. He purchased small cafes, billiard rooms, and betting offices, ordinary businesses that served as legitimate fronts and comfortable meeting places. Soon he became a familiar figure, not just as a protector on the racecourses, but as a man of influence in Little Italy, someone who could help arrange employment or ease trouble with the law. Young men began looking to him for guidance. Older residents approached him with family concerns. Respect, once taken from others by force, was now offered willingly, even eagerly. But outside London, trouble brewed. Another powerful figure claimed authority over racecourses in the North and Midlands, the notorious Billy Kimber, leader of the Birmingham Boys. Kimber was just as ambitious as Sabini, but louder, more impulsive, and quicker to reach for weapons. His gang had controlled southern tracks before the Great War and believed that they were entitled to reclaim them afterward. As soldiers returned from service, many drifted back into criminal groups, bringing wartime aggression with them. It was only a matter of time before the two organizations collided. The first clashes were small, sharp words exchanged behind grandstands, punches thrown when crowds drifted away, bookmakers approached by one side after already paying the other. But with every track they both claimed, tensions rose. By 1919, the confrontation had spilled into violence, sometimes fought in plain sight of police officers unprepared for the ferocity of organized turf war. Yet neither side could win decisive control. Kimber had numbers, but Darby had discipline and a growing network of supporters. When the conflict finally came into the open, it was on a scale London had not seen among gambling gangs before. The decisive confrontation unfolded in the early 1920s during the famous Epsom Derby. Kimber's men travelled south in convoy, carrying razors, iron bars, and improvised weapons. Sabini, having heard through quiet channels what was planned, gathered his own forces, men hand-picked from Clerkenwell and Soho. They met somewhere along the road between Croydon and Epsom. Witnesses later described a wild scene, men dragged from cars, windows smashed, bodies left bleeding on the gravel. It resembled a battlefield more than a roadside brawl. When police reinforcements eventually arrived, Kimber's gang suffered heavy arrests, while Darby, who had kept himself in a safer position, observed from distance and slipped away before names could be taken. The impact was immediate. Kimber withdrew north, bruised, wounded, and effectively beaten. The South belonged to Sabini from that moment on, and the bookmakers understood that there was only one man who controlled their safety thereafter. His influence expanded rapidly. By the early 1920s, Darby commanded a network of disciplined enforcers spread across southern England. They controlled Epsom, Brighton, Hove, Lewes, and most of the lucrative circuits. Bookmakers paid without question. Those who tried to resist soon changed their minds after an unpleasant encounter or two. Yet what set Darby apart was his restraint. Violence in his system was not the first answer. It was the final reminder, and with growing power came wealth. Darby bought a fine motor car, moved his family into better housing, and continued to invest quietly in legitimate businesses. But to the outside world, he remained discreet, never showing excessive wealth nor boasting about influence. He preferred to look like a respectable bookmaker rather than a criminal king, and in a London crowded with loud men, that silence made him more dangerous than all the shouting gangsters combined. Now, as the decade unfolded in his favour, Sabini was no longer just a streetwise boy from Little Italy. He was becoming the undisputed master of the southern racetracks, feared when necessary, respected by many, and watched closely by police who, for the moment, could prove nothing. But power like his never lasts unchallenged, and the world around him was beginning to notice that beneath his polite manner was a man who had transformed intimidation into a business, and business was only just beginning. As the 1920s unfolded, the atmosphere of Britain changed, yet on the racecourses, things continued almost as before. Crowds gathered as though the war that had bled Europe was a far-off dream, and not a memory still sharp in countless families. Soldiers on leave, factory workers enjoying new wages, and even officers seeking distraction all stood at the rails, as if gambling might hide the deeper uncertainties of the times. This steady flow of humanity meant that money continued to pulse through the betting rings, and wherever money moved rapidly, there were always men waiting to direct its path. Darby now understood something only a few men of his generation ever grasped. He did not need to threaten everyone. He needed only to convince most. He did this through careful manners, calm conversation, and a reputation that did most of the talking for him. Word spread quietly that any bookmaker who did business without his approval risked far more than financial loss. The implication hung in the air like an unspoken treaty. Pay him, and the day passed without trouble. Refuse, and misfortune found you quickly. At the same time, Darby developed a network that extended deeper into Clerkenwell. He rarely involved himself in petty crime. Instead, he built connections with businessmen, cafe owners, bookmakers' agents, and others who lived on the edge of respectability. When disputes arose, people sought him out quietly. A man who owed money, a quarrel between families, even a disagreement that threatened to become violent, Darby positioned himself as a mediator, someone whose calm word could end a feud more effectively than police intervention. In the cafes around Saffron Hill, he could be found at a corner table, listening more than speaking, deciding with few words how a quarrel would resolve. This role elevated him. He was no longer simply a man who could intimidate troublemakers at race meetings. He had become a figure of authority among those who struggled to negotiate London's complicated social order. Mothers whispered to restless boys that Darby Sabini would hear of their behavior. Young men approached him humbly, hoping for work or protection. What he offered was simple: loyalty for loyalty. Betrayal was rare, and when it occurred, it vanished swiftly beneath circumstances no one cared to examine closely. But beyond the southern counties, resentment boiled silently. Many bookmakers from the Midlands and North, especially older men who had worked freely before the war, resented paying tribute to any outside force. They complained that the Italian boys from Clerkenwell were little more than extortionists who had wrapped themselves in the appearance of business. Yet most understood that refusal meant chaos. Even the police, short-staffed and suspicious of violent gangs, often preferred a quiet arrangement that preserved order at crowded race meetings. In their eyes, Darby's presence ensured fewer brawls, fewer robberies, and fewer scenes that called for an official report. His dominance brought a kind of uneasy peace, and authorities tolerated the visible calm without asking too many questions about the invisible machinery that enforced it. Meanwhile, Darby's wealth continued to increase, and he invested where money could grow quietly. He purchased property near Brighton and Hove, as if preparing for a future no longer dependent solely on protection payments. He wanted more than immediate profit. He wanted foundation, legacy, and security for his family. He was ambitious, yes, but calculating rather than reckless. He dressed neatly, spoke politely, and cultivated an image that concealed the darker structure of his operations. What people did not see was how organized his system had become. Each race meeting had assigned collectors, men whose quiet job was to walk among bookmakers and receive payment without fuss. These collectors turned in money to higher-ranking associates who kept careful records under Darby's watchful eye. Every man knew his place, every action followed unwritten rules, and anyone who stepped out of line faced a reprimand that might be a warning, or something less reversible. Still, power of this sort does not remain uncontested forever. As the middle of the decade approached, new rivals emerged. Some from other cities, others from within Little Italy itself. The Cortesi brothers, another Anglo-Italian family with history in Clerkenwell, resented Darby's control and sought to challenge his authority. They believed the streets and opportunities belonged to the entire community, not to one man. Beneath polite greetings lay bitterness, as though Clerkenwell were too small for two families with ambition. Small arguments became sharp words became threats, and threats turned quickly into violence. The feud that followed was brief, but it revealed the darker edges of Darby's empire. Two men were stabbed, police raided nearby properties, and rumours circulated about disappearances that no one cared to investigate too closely. The Corteses eventually withdrew or vanished entirely, and Darby's supremacy over Little Italy remained intact. He had defended his position not with loud declarations, but through quiet, decisive action, an approach that always defined his character. But the true threat in those years was not another Italian family. It was the changing nature of London itself. After the war, the world was shifting, and many young men sought new identities. They were hardened, hungry, and often unwilling to accept old rules. While Darby continued to manage his empire through calm intimidation, a younger generation was beginning to imagine different shapes of power, more aggressive, more public, and more dangerous. Darby's restraint set him apart, but restraint alone would not protect him forever. Still, for the moment, the southern racecourses remained his. Bookmakers paid, crowds stayed orderly, and the newspapers occasionally hinted about the presence of certain Italian influences without naming him. Darby's authority depended not on shouting, but on being understood. He did not need to be seen everywhere. It was enough that people believed he could appear anywhere he wished. For more than a decade, that belief allowed him to rule uncontested, and for those years, the racecourses of southern England belonged quietly to a polite man from Little Italy. By the middle of the 1920s, something unusual began to happen in London's underworld. Instead of shrinking or fading after the violent clashes of the post-war years, Darby's influence seemed to settle into place like a stone dropped neatly into water. The ripples of confrontation had passed, leaving him at the center of a wide, calm circle. This calm was not peace in any gentle sense. It was the kind of order that exists only when everyone understands who controls the ground beneath their feet. On the racecourses of southern England, that control belonged to him. Bookmakers acknowledged this openly in private and silently in public. They adjusted the cost of doing business by adding a quiet payment to the Italian from Clerkenwell. To outsiders, these arrangements might have looked like extortion, and in many ways they were. But Darby understood that people accepted exploitation more easily when it was wrapped in professionalism. He made sure his men conducted themselves with manners, wearing dark suits, speaking politely, and avoiding unnecessary noise. They were not drunkards or hot-headed thugs. They were men who looked like clerks or tradesmen, which allowed them to operate in daylight without immediately attracting suspicion. The appearance of respectability was his most effective disguise. Many in authority convinced themselves that if disorder was kept away from the racecourse gates, then whatever happened behind the scenes could be quietly ignored. But Darby had no intention of limiting himself to racecourses alone. The nightlife of London offered other opportunities. Soho, with its dim alleys and smoky clubs, attracted gamblers, moneylenders, showgirls, and wealthy men looking for escapism. Behind heavy curtains, private rooms filled with music and cigarette smoke became the places where bets were made and debts quietly agreed upon. Darby invested in nightclubs partly for money, partly for influence, and partly because these social centers allowed him to understand the moods of the city. Every evening, conversations crossed his path. Whispers about wealthy individuals, gossip about police intentions, and rumors of new criminal gangs rising elsewhere in the country. Some of the men who visited these places were impressed by Darby's politeness and self-control. Others feared it, unsure whether his soft voice concealed anger or whether his silence hid calculation. Very few guessed that behind his calm exterior was a man who measured every person he met, weighing their intentions and weaknesses. In business and intimidation, knowledge was currency, and Darby collected information with the same discipline he applied to collecting payments from bookmakers. During these years, his ability to judge character became a weapon far sharper than any blade. He placed trustworthy associates in carefully chosen roles, creating a network that stretched from the gymnasiums of Holborn to the gambling rooms of Brighton. Each man reported back not with dramatic stories but with useful details. Who was making money? Who was borrowing heavily? Who disliked paying debts? Who carried grudges? All of these fragments, when gathered and examined, allowed Darby to predict conflicts before they erupted and to shape outcomes that favoured him without appearing directly involved. Police records from the time hint at growing suspicion, though they struggled to gather evidence. Some officers doubted the scale of his influence, believing the stories were exaggerated. Others suspected that the lack of violence was itself proof of organisation, that someone with authority was keeping tempers under control, preventing the kind of drunken brawls that drew newspapers and public criticism. But the law could do little without witnesses, and witnesses among bookmakers were scarce. A bookmaker who refused to cooperate with Darby's men risked more than financial discomfort. He risked losing his livelihood entirely. It was easier for everyone to pretend nothing was wrong. Yet beneath this surface of order, London's underworld was not static. A new generation of criminals was emerging, influenced by the glamour of American gangsters and eager to carve out reputations of their own. They paid attention to the newspapers coming from across the Atlantic, reading about men who controlled entire neighborhoods and who wore suits while running criminal empires. Some openly admired the ruthlessness of figures like Al Capone, imagining themselves as British versions of those notorious leaders. What they didn't understand was that Darby had already created the foundation of such a role long before most of them were old enough to shave. Still, admiration did not always mean loyalty. Younger men sometimes questioned why Darby preferred subtlety to spectacle. They wanted fast results, quick intimidation, violent methods that left dramatic messages. Darby discouraged these impulses, warning that attention invited destruction. Those who ignored him occasionally disappeared from his circle and were replaced by others more willing to follow rules written only in understanding. He knew that arrogance and impatience were the fastest ways to ruin an empire, and he refused to let youth drag him into reckless experiments. In those years, his routine rarely changed. He rose early, visited racecourses or betting offices, checked on the businesses that carried his name discreetly in their paperwork, and returned home to his wife and growing family. To neighbours, he seemed almost ordinary, quiet, respectable, distant perhaps, but not alarming. He dressed well, but not extravagantly. He spoke politely, attended church sometimes, and rarely appeared in newspapers. That was precisely how he wanted it. True power, he believed, never demanded applause. It didn't need attention, it only needed obedience. Despite this careful balance, there were limits to what silence could prevent. By the late 1920s, the country was tightening laws surrounding gambling, and police forces were better organized than before. The racecourse world had begun to shift under the pressure of new regulations. The press published occasional articles implying the existence of criminal networks, influencing betting, and although they rarely mentioned names, informed readers understood who stood behind these insinuations. The more London pretended not to see him, the more obvious his shadow became, and shadows always grow longer before darkness finally arrives. By the time the decade drew toward its close, Darby had built something that few English criminals of his era had ever managed. He had turned violence into a kind of organized service, a business model that functioned under the polite name of protection. Behind the calm exterior of race meetings, he had assembled an organization that resembled a small company. There were trusted lieutenants, men who collected fees, men who watched crowds, and others who acted as enforcers only when absolutely necessary. There were codes of behavior and a hierarchy that everyone understood, even if no document ever described it. To outsiders, the structure was invisible, yet it operated with an efficiency that many legitimate businesses struggled to achieve. Central to the entire enterprise was fear, but fear delivered quietly, almost politely. Darby understood the psychological value of uncertainty. A bookmaker who resisted payment might never receive a direct threat, but he might notice unfamiliar men near his stall. He might hear a rumor that someone else had suffered misfortune. He might find himself approached days later by a gentle voice reminding him that safety had always been available, if only he agreed to it. The threat was rarely spoken aloud. It lived in the silence surrounding each offer. Sometimes a chalk mark appeared on a shop window or a bookmaker's front door after a disagreement, a simple symbol without explanation. It carried more weight than a shouted warning. Everyone in that world recognized such marks as quiet promises of future trouble. Few people needed a second reminder, and when persuasion failed, stronger lessons followed. A bookmaker who continued to resist might return home bruised or discover that a valuable race day was suddenly unsettled by anonymous disturbances. No one pointed a finger toward Darby, yet everyone understood whose patience had expired. Rumors spread that the Italians carried razors sewn into their coat sleeves, ready to flick open with a casual movement. The truth was that only a small number of them did, but the image of a hidden blade glimmering against a lapel gave the entire organization a fearsome reputation. Violence was selective, almost surgical. It left marks intended not to kill but to remind. A scar could speak for years, warning others against repeating the same mistake. In this way, brutality became an investment, a long-term message carved into flesh. Beyond the racecourses, Darby extended his influence quietly into club life, greyhound tracks and betting offices scattered across London's more discreet corners. He lent money privately, often at high interest, and the terms of repayment were generous until they were not. He handled disputes for nightclub owners, ensuring that drunken customers were removed without trouble and that debts from private games were settled promptly. Many club owners preferred his methods over official involvement, believing that a quiet man with disciplined associates could solve problems more efficiently than the law. Money moved upward through the organization. Earnings from one track flowed into investments at another. Loans fed into nightclub shares. Greyhound earnings funded new ventures just far enough away from prying eyes. The wealth accumulating at the top was considerable. At a time when a working man might bring home a few pounds a week, Darby could earn several hundred in a single day at a well-attended race meeting. His fortune turned into property, businesses and influence, disguised beneath accounts that appeared tedious and perfectly ordinary. He crafted an image that made suspicion difficult. Always neatly dressed, he travelled with the calm composure of a respectable bookmaker. His polished car, driven by a proper chauffeur, could have belonged to any middle-class businessman. At cafes in Saffron Hill, he sat in quiet corners, surrounded by his closest men, speaking in low voices. Nothing about his appearance suggested a criminal empire. Even the police, who watched him with growing impatience, struggled to catch him in a crime. His orders were given indirectly, his fingerprints absent from the actions carried out in his name. Some detectives, particularly those of the newly strengthened flying squad, regarded this subtlety as the most dangerous trait of all. They wrote internal reports describing an Italian figure who acted as a controlling influence across southern counties, whose discipline and organization matched the methods of well-known American racketeers. But without witnesses willing to speak, the evidence remained little more than suspicion floating between police memos. Darby's authority survived precisely because he governed without spectacle. Nevertheless, success attracted rivals. New figures emerged from the edges of the underworld, eager to claim a part of the southern territory. In the East End, other bookmakers experimented with their own security networks. In the north, remnants of Kimber's men reorganized, hoping to recover what they believed had once belonged to them. Even within Clerkenwell, jealousy simmered among those who felt Darby had grown too powerful, too wealthy, and too careful to share opportunity with others. The Cortesi brothers attempted to challenge him, believing that the Italian enclave belonged not to a single family, but to a community. Their conflict with Darby turned from rivalry to violence, and in a matter of weeks it ended with disappearances and sudden departures that silenced further challenge. No police case ever succeeded, and the saboteurs faded like ghosts, remembered only in cautious whispers. Darby remained at the top of the southern underworld, a figure who ruled with confidence but rarely with noise. Through the middle of the decade, he was more than a criminal. He was a patron of his neighborhood, someone whose generosity softened the harder corners of his reputation. He paid rent for struggling widows, sent turkeys to families at Christmas, and helped young offenders find work rather than jail cells. Many in Little Italy saw him not as a threat, but as a protector, someone whose influence shielded them from both rival gangs and the indifference of authorities. Yet outside Clerkenwell, resentment built steadily. Some police commanders grew tired of being forced to negotiate with an unofficial authority. Some bookmakers felt the cost of protection creeping upward, eating into slim profits. Members of the Jockey Club watched nervously as reports of gang intimidation tarnished the image of their sport. And across London, a younger generation, restless, ambitious, and unaffected by the old codes of loyalty, began imagining a future with themselves in Darby's position. For now, however, the reign remained untouched. Darby held his territory not only through fear, but through quiet certainty. Every bookmaker, every club owner, every ambitious young gangster understood that there was one man they would eventually have to face, one man whose approval or anger could shape their fate. He did not shout to make himself heard. His silence was enough. As the final years of the 1920s approached, a curious contradiction began forming around Darby's life. Publicly, he appeared almost respectable, the sort of bookmaker or businessman who might have developed his fortune through shrewd investments and cautious dealings. Privately, his operations expanded with precision, shaping themselves around every weakness that London presented. He seldom appeared in any police file, except as a name attached to whispers or informal notes. Yet nearly every relevant officer in the metropolitan area had heard of him, often through sideways remarks made by bookmakers who appeared too nervous to speak directly. Reporters attempted occasionally to interview him, but they came away with little more than quiet answers. He rarely denied anything directly, yet he never admitted involvement in intimidation or protection. When asked how he earned his living, he spoke of horses, betting and business, shrugging off any suggestion of wrongdoing with a slight smile that revealed nothing. He avoided flamboyance, preferring an ordinary life that disguised extraordinary power. The contrast fascinated those who paid attention. A man whose control was rooted in fear, yet who acted with remarkable politeness, almost like a businessman discussing routine matters rather than a criminal directing a widespread enterprise. But pressure was mounting from beyond the quiet edges of his world. The British government, influenced by growing public discomfort about criminal influence in sport, began discussing reforms that could restrict illegal betting and enforce stricter licensing rules. At first, these discussions meant little, but eventually they pointed directly toward Darby's interests. The Jockey Club grew increasingly embarrassed by violent incidents near tracks and urged the authorities to clean up gambling culture. For years, the problem had been hidden beneath polite silence, but now newspapers were eager to highlight stories of intimidation, especially when they involved knives, razors, or whispered threats exchanged under grandstands. Despite external pressure, Darby remained remarkably composed. He simply adjusted his methods. Instead of allowing large groups of enforcers to gather openly at tracks, he began sending fewer men, often just enough to make a point without attracting attention. Many of his lieutenants learned to blend into crowds with even greater subtlety, appearing as spectators or clerks, hiding their affiliation beneath ordinary clothes. The gang began relying more on quiet collectors and discreet warnings rather than physical clashes. Violence was reserved for rare situations, not abandoned, but used like a scalpel rather than a club. Meanwhile, other areas of London crime evolved alongside him. Figures like Alf White, a Jewish bookmaker with ambitions of his own, expanded operations in the East End. Young men, including the future Jack Spot, learned how rackets operated by watching men like Alf White and indirectly by watching Darby himself. The underworld began to reorganize around structures of modern criminal entrepreneurship rather than street brawling. The country was changing. Trams, telephones and motorcars allowed faster movement, wider territory and greater opportunities for networking. Darby, once a pioneer, now found himself at risk of becoming old-fashioned. He belonged to a generation shaped by street loyalties, neighborhood codes, and quiet relationships within tight communities. The younger gangsters emerging from the East End saw things differently. They thought in terms of expansion beyond local areas, in terms of business networks that spanned cities rather than neighborhoods. They used accountants, legitimate fronts, and modern communications. Darby still controlled territory, but he did so in ways that belonged to a world slowly disappearing. Even within his organization, murmurs of impatience surfaced. Some younger members wanted to modernize more aggressively, to involve themselves in other lucrative crimes, or to push into territories that offered richer opportunities. They questioned Darby's caution, wondering whether restraint made him vulnerable. To them, his methods appeared too calm, too slow, too reliant on tradition. But they underestimated something crucial. Darby understood the dangers of sudden expansion. He had lived through street violence and had seen larger gangs fall apart through internal greed or reckless ambition. He believed that a slow, steady profit earned over years was safer than a large, risky fortune, gained overnight. Still, the law was tightening its grip. Police attention towards the racecourses increased noticeably in 1930 and 1931 as new officers trained to monitor illegal betting operations joined the force. Raids were conducted more frequently, and inspectors demanded licenses and identification from anyone who appeared suspicious. While none of these measures could undo Darby's influence overnight, they forced him to adapt again. He directed his organization to step deeper into indirect profits, loan sharking, nightclub operations, fencing stolen goods, and providing quiet security to establishments that feared violent patrons. He began forming relationships with politicians and businessmen who frequented the nightlife of Soho. Private conversations over dinner gave him glimpses into upcoming police activity and political discussions. Sometimes, these details allowed him to shift operations just ahead of police raids. Other times, they told him which rivals were under investigation and which opportunities might be closing soon. He used information as others used weapons, quietly and effectively. But cracks had begun to form beneath the polished surface of his world. For years, Darby had balanced violence and respectability, fear and politeness. Now, the forces of change, the economy, the press, younger criminals and anxious authorities began pushing against the fragile calm he had built. His influence remained formidable, yet the ground beneath it no longer felt as solid as before. He had spent almost 2 decades creating a system that depended on caution. The decade ahead would test whether caution alone could survive a world growing impatient with shadows. Although Darby managed to adjust his methods through the early 1930s, the pressure that surrounded him never truly eased. It simply changed shape. Where once the danger came from rival gangs or ambitious street fighters, now it emerged from offices in Westminster and committee rooms of the Jockey Club. The government wanted respectable sport, and respectable sport could not coexist with whispers of extortion. Not openly, at least. The authorities could overlook violence if it kept worse violence at bay, but they could not ignore newspaper editorials calling for investigations. Public embarrassment had become a greater enemy than fistfights, and the police began treating Darby less like a necessary evil and more like a visible problem. His response was subtle. He reduced his presence at racecourses and removed some of his most recognizable associates from key positions. He shifted investments further into nightclubs, where legal ownership disguised deeper connections. He cultivated friendships with businessmen and actors, even minor politicians, men who enjoyed his hospitality in elegant dining rooms and who believed, or pretended to believe, that he was nothing more than a prosperous bookmaker with curious Italian roots. At restaurants in Soho, he was seen quietly, sharing meals, his soft voice blending with conversation about horses and sport. The most dangerous thing about him was that he always looked ordinary. He had learned over years that intimidation worked best when delivered by rumor instead of confrontation. But reputation alone could not stop the march of time. Younger criminals paid attention to his every movement. Some imitated him, hoping to build their own carefully controlled operations. Others blamed him for holding London's criminal world back. The East End, especially, became fertile ground for a new generation of racketeers who did not rely on neighborhood loyalties or shared immigrant origins. These were men who saw opportunity not in community protection, but in rapid expansion. Among them was a restless young man named Jack Comer, later known as Jack Spot, whose sharp intelligence and hunger for notoriety would reshape the underworld after the war. Jack absorbed lessons not just from Alf White and other East End figures, but indirectly from men like Darby, whose approach combined intimidation with a businessman's restraint. The underworld was changing. Criminals now thought in terms of territory, networks and influence rather than street corners or single racecourses. To Darby, this shift was both impressive and ominous. He was admired as a pioneer, yet slowly becoming outdated. His silence, once a shield, risked becoming irrelevance as louder and more ambitious men stepped forward. Even so, the older bookmakers continued paying him, because fear is a habit that lasts long after logic fades. The habit of payment had been established over decades. Very few were willing to test what might happen if they stopped. Despite his attempts to remain discreet, the flying squad intensified efforts to dismantle extortion networks. Surveillance increased, phone lines were tapped, informants were paid. Some policemen believed that Darby's downfall could be achieved only by isolating him from his sources of income and turning his lieutenants against him. Yet betrayal was rare. Loyalty, once purchased through generosity and enforced by fear, had settled into something resembling respect. The younger gangsters may have questioned his style, but those who had served him for years were reluctant to risk his anger, even now that the empire seemed less secure. For the first time, Darby felt genuine vulnerability. His strategy had always depended on controlling specific physical spaces, racecourses, cafes, nightclubs. But the world was shifting beyond those spaces. Economic uncertainty and political tension cast long shadows across Britain. The Great Depression brought unemployment, forcing desperate men to seek livelihoods in crime, changing the balance of power. Racecourse crowds shrank, and with them the steady flow of easy money. Darby's organization continued to function, but not with the effortless growth it had enjoyed during the Roaring Decade. As the decade progressed, loneliness crept in around him. Some of his oldest supporters retired or died. Others simply drifted away, content to pursue quieter lives while they still could. A few of the younger men he had once relied on began questioning why they should continue following rules designed for a different world. Darby's authority depended on rituals and relationships that belonged to pre-war London and its tight immigrant communities. But the second generation of Anglo-Italians now saw themselves as Londoners first, Italians second, and loyalty to a single patriarch no longer felt inevitable. Darby sensed this subtle erosion of certainty. He continued attending race meetings, but the crowds were thinner, and the younger bookmakers paid him out of habit rather than fear. The old stories of razors and violence still circulated, but they sounded like legends rather than real threats. At cafes, he still sat at his usual place, but conversations seemed shorter, and men greeted him with polite gestures rather than eager attention. A man can rule through silence only as long as others choose to listen for the quietest commands. Even so, Darby refused to retreat from the life he had built. He dressed each morning with the same careful neatness, travelled with the same polished car, and maintained the same manner of confident restraint. To him, respect was not something he could step away from, not without admitting weakness. He continued as if nothing had changed, even though the ground beneath him trembled with the approach of a world he could not command. By the late 1930s, a new threat approached, one that had nothing to do with rival gangsters or suspicious police officers. Europe was tilting toward catastrophe again. War approached like a dark cloud, slow at first, then inevitable. And war, unlike rivals or newspapers, would not negotiate with a man like Darby Sabini. This time, the danger would not come from alleys or betting rings. It would arrive from beyond the channel, wrapped in a different flag, one that carried his family's name and which would transform him, almost overnight, from a feared English bookmaker into something far more dangerous in the eyes of the British state. When the war finally erupted in Europe and Britain declared its stance against Germany, London once again braced itself for a storm. Darby at first believed that this conflict, like the previous one, would change little about his professional life. In the First World War, race meetings had continued almost undisturbed, and gamblers had still sought distraction from grim headlines. But the Second World War arrived under different circumstances. This time, the threat was felt in the very bones of the city. Bomb shelters replaced nightclubs, blackouts replaced neon signs, and the great crowds that once gathered at racecourses were scattered by fear, rationing, and strict travel limitations. The flow of money dried almost overnight. Darby discovered quickly that the war was not simply an interruption. It was the destruction of the world from which he had drawn power. His empire had been built on movement, people travelling, betting freely, seeking entertainment. Suddenly, trains were restricted, petrol was rationed, and public gatherings were discouraged or cancelled entirely. Race meetings became rare and modest affairs, stripped of their colourful crowds. Without the crowd, the bookmakers who paid him protection no longer had business to protect. The lifeline of his wealth evaporated, not by police intervention, but by a global catastrophe too large for any gangster to control. Even more dangerous than the collapse of the racetrack economy was the political climate surrounding anyone of foreign descent. Darby had lived his entire life in Britain, but his roots were undeniably Italian. The name he carried, the heritage he had never denied, now became a liability far heavier than any police accusation. When Italy joined the war on Germany's side, suspicion intensified. The newspapers did not need to accuse him of treachery. The government itself began viewing every Italian-born or Italian-descended resident as a potential threat. Neighbours who had known Italian families for decades suddenly regarded them with unease. Cafes and shops owned by Italian immigrants were vandalized. Entire communities were punished by a war they had no part in choosing. Darby, who had always considered himself British by life and loyalty, could not escape the classification imposed by the Home Office. In official files, he was still listed under his birth name, a name that connected him not to Clerkenwell or London, but to a foreign country now considered an enemy. His protestations meant little. The state, driven by fear and suspicion, began rounding up Italians across the nation. Men were arrested in their homes, often without charge, and taken to internment camps. Darby did not imagine that the law, which had never succeeded in convicting him of violent crimes, would one day imprison him simply because of his heritage. Yet that was precisely what happened. In the spring of 1940, he was arrested at a Greyhound Stadium in Hove, a location where he had tried to rebuild a sliver of his former influence. The arrest was not the result of evidence against him, but a sweeping order under wartime regulations, claiming that people of enemy nationality must be detained for national security. He was transported from one holding site to another until he was eventually interned on the Isle of Man, an island that had transformed into a strange half-prison for thousands of Italian, German, and Austrian men, many of whom were nothing more than restaurant owners, waiters, or tailors who had lived peacefully in Britain for decades. The camps themselves were bleak but not brutal, organized like makeshift towns surrounded by barbed wire. Some internees were genuine fascist sympathizers, while others had been caught in a net cast far too wide by fear. For Darby, greatest punishment was not physical confinement, but forced powerlessness. He could no longer command, influence, or gather information. He spent long hours pacing within the camp boundaries, calculating in silence the world outside that was collapsing without him. Each day, his organization weakened further. Rival networks advanced, his lieutenants dispersed, and bookmakers liberated from obligation moved on without paying tribute. By the time he was released 18 months later, after complicated petitions and local support emphasizing his British birth, the empire he had built over 2 decades had nearly dissolved. He returned to a London scarred by bombings, the neighborhoods of his youth darkened by the Blitz, and the once lively Italian community scattered by hostility and suspicion. He could no longer rely on the fear that had once been instinctive. People now feared larger things: air raids, hunger, and loss. A gangster's threat seemed trivial next to a dictator's war. Despite the ruin of his former influence, Darby refused to surrender completely. He returned to bookmaking not in the grand manner he once enjoyed, but as an ordinary man struggling to maintain a livelihood. He worked legally, keeping detailed records, cautious not to attract police attention. But the world of gambling had changed, regulated by wartime necessity and government oversight. Even his name, spoken in whispers for decades, no longer carried the same weight. Those who encountered him now treated him more as a quiet relic of a vanished age than as a man to be feared. Yet fate had not finished reshaping him. In 1943, he was arrested once more, this time accused of handling stolen goods, an accusation rooted less in his actions and more in his lingering reputation. Evidence was thin but sufficient, and a judge sentenced him to 3 years in prison. For a man who had spent his life avoiding conviction through caution, strategy, and silence, being found guilty not for violence but for petty fencing was a cruel irony. While he sat in prison, tragedy struck his family with a force nothing in his past could match. His only son, serving the Royal Air Force, was killed in action over Egypt. The news reached him in his cell, and those present later remembered how the strength seemed to drain from him in a moment. He murmured that the name would end with his son, and those who had once seen him command racecourses now saw him silently confronting a loss deeper than any defeat he had ever suffered. He left prison with a heart burdened by grief, stepping into a world in which he no longer held power and no longer wished to reclaim it fully. The man who emerged from confinement was not the king of racecourses. He was a father who had outlived his child, and no wealth or fear he had once inspired could shield him from that final, most human devastation. When the war finally ended, London emerged from devastation looking nothing like the city Darby had once ruled. The rubble-strewn streets, the ration lines, the hollow eyes of returning soldiers, everything spoke of a world too exhausted to remember the old conflicts of bookmakers and racecourse gangs. The underworld itself had changed shape. Young figures, some hardened by wartime black markets, others sharpened by military discipline, now stepped forward into territories once controlled by quieter generations. Names like Jack Spot and Billy Hill began appearing in conversations that used to revolve around older men, and newspapers turned their attention toward new crimes, new scandals, and new personalities eager for notoriety. When Darby returned fully to civilian life, he did so almost anonymously. The old cafes of Saffron Hill no longer echoed with familiar voices. Many of the Anglo-Italian families that had once formed the heart of Little Italy scattered during the war, some changing their names to avoid suspicion, others moving out of the bombed neighborhood altogether. The close-knit world that had supported Darby's rise disappeared into council estates and new suburbs, leaving behind only fragments of a community that once treated him like a patriarch. He moved permanently to the south coast, settling in Brighton and Hove, where the sea washed against the shore with a rhythm far calmer than anything he had ever known in Clerkenwell. There he lived quietly, keeping a modest bookmaking business and avoiding attention. His neighbours saw a polite, slightly reserved man who walked the same streets each day, took evening strolls near the water, and attended Sunday Mass without ceremony. Only a handful of older Londoners recognised him, and even they spoke of him cautiously, as if unsure whether the legend of the racecourse king had truly belonged to the man buying groceries at the corner shop. In these final years, Darby rarely spoke of his past. If someone hinted at old stories, he dismissed them with a gesture or a quiet remark that nothing romantic existed in violence. He spent long evenings reading newspapers, clipping articles about new gang figures, following their activities as if observing a world that had once been his but now belonged to others. Occasionally, he sent small amounts of money to old acquaintances or assisted families who had fallen into difficulty. He did so without seeking gratitude, perhaps recalling the poverty of his own childhood and the precarious fortune that had shaped his life. Yet even in retirement, rumours clung to him like shadows. People speculated about hidden money, accounts kept under other names, and fortunes tucked away beyond the reach of police or taxes. These stories were partly fantasy, partly truth. When he died, his official estate appeared surprisingly small, causing puzzled comments among those who remembered the wealth he had once controlled. Only later did additional funds surface, confirming that even in his last years, Darby preferred secrecy over spectacle, concealment over public wealth. He was found one October morning, lying peacefully in bed, his heart finally surrendering after decades strained by conflict, prison, grief, and the weight of a life carried between power and caution. The funeral was modest. A small procession followed the hearse. His widow, his daughters, a few surviving comrades who had once stood beside him on race days, and several quiet faces from an older Clerkenwell that no longer existed. There were no newspaper cameras, no policemen watching from a distance, no curious crowds, only the sea wind and a handful of people who understood parts of a story larger and more complicated than any of them could fully describe. After he was lowered into the ground, those who had known him lingered briefly, perhaps remembering the razor-sharp eyes of the young man who once ruled the southern racecourses and the soft-spoken figure who could command silence without raising his voice. Then they left him there, in a peaceful corner of a coastal cemetery, beneath an English sky that had witnessed both his rise and his fall. But death did not erase him. In pubs and private conversations across Brighton and Clerkenwell, his name drifted through memory like cigarette smoke curling above a bar counter. Older men told younger ones about the Italian who controlled bookmakers with a glance, the polite enforcer who made violence seem unnecessary simply by standing nearby. They spoke of him half with admiration, half with unease, unable to decide whether he had been a villain, a guardian, or both. That uncertainty was the truest measure of the man, a contradiction stitched into London's criminal history, surviving long after the chalk marks had faded from doors and the racecourses had forgotten the man who once claimed them as his own. Even as the years passed and the underworld reshaped itself with new kings and new methods, the figure of Darby Sabini remained like a faint outline under fresh paint. Historians found him fascinating precisely because he resisted easy classification. He had not been a street brawler in the crude sense, nor a glamorous criminal like those who dominated American headlines. Instead, he became something uniquely British, a polite threat, a disciplined shadow, a businessman whose handshake meant protection and whose silence meant danger. The legacy he left behind belonged neither to heroism nor to outright infamy. It lived in the grey space where criminality and respectability intersected more often than anyone wished to admit. And in that space, his memory stayed alive, whispered in half-truths, carried through generations of stories. The man who once ruled with quiet authority had become a legend, not because of loud violence, but because of the strange mixture of courtesy, danger, loyalty, and fear that made him impossible to forget, even when the world around him changed beyond recognition. Long after Darby Sabini was gone, the city he once controlled continued to evolve, layer over layer, until the old racecourse wars were remembered only through rumours, archived court documents, and aging men who still sat at the back of pubs retelling stories that seemed half myth. Yet his influence never completely vanished. It lived quietly inside the structure of organised crime that emerged in Britain after the war, shaping the ambitions of men who never met him but who inherited the system he left behind. What had started in the narrow lanes of Clerkenwell eventually grew into a blueprint for criminal operations that stretched far beyond racetracks. Whenever modern crime historians examined the transition from old-fashioned brawling gangs to structured underworld enterprises, Darby's name reappeared, not always praised, not always condemned, but always acknowledged as a figure too important to ignore. He had not been Britain's most violent gangster, far from it. Others spilt more blood, but blood alone doesn't build an empire. What built his was the quiet understanding that fear travels fastest when spoken softly. That lesson remained long after razor blades rusted and the faces of his enemies blurred into obscurity. Those who tried to define him after his death often disagreed. Some wrote that he exploited vulnerable communities at a time when the police turned a blind eye. Others said he protected those same communities from outside hostility at a moment when immigrant families struggled to survive prejudice and poverty. Both things might be true, and perhaps the truth is that he never intended to become either a villain or a guardian. He simply used whatever power the world offered him, until circumstances forced him into darker corridors where survival demanded decisions that rarely came with moral clarity. Even within the Italian community of Clerkenwell, memories divided. Older residents recalled him as someone who helped with rent, paid for funerals, and arranged work for young men who might otherwise have ended up in prison. They remembered Christmas turkeys, envelopes of money quietly delivered, and a sense of security that came from knowing someone powerful was watching over the neighborhood. Younger generations, raised long after the horrors of poverty and xenophobia eased, saw his story differently. To them, he was simply another name linked to criminality. But stories told by grandparents lingered, and through those stories, the ghost of Sabini remained present in the cultural memory of a community that no longer physically existed. In the decades following his death, writers, historians, and filmmakers rediscovered him. His name resurfaced in articles that analysed London crime, in academic studies that searched for origins of British organised gangs, and later in television dramas that romanticised gangsters from another era. Each retelling added new colours, sometimes darkening his history, sometimes softening it, never fully capturing the private reality of a man whose life unfolded behind guarded eyes. What remained undeniable, however, was that the structure of post-war British crime, its networks, its business arrangements, even its quiet respectability, owed much to the model Darby unintentionally pioneered. Had he lived longer, perhaps he would have been interviewed by modern journalists fascinated with his unique role in the evolution of organised crime. Perhaps documentaries would have captured his voice, letting him tell his side of events with that calm tone that once commanded entire racetracks. But fate never offered him that stage. He left the world quietly, as though disappearing behind a closing door, leaving others to guess at motives he never explained, and maybe that was intentional. Silence had always been his strongest weapon, and in the end, silence became his legacy as well. Standing near his grave today, a visitor might see nothing remarkable, just a weathered stone among many others, surrounded by wind, grass, and the distant crash of waves. No grand monument marks his resting place, no statue stands in his honor. Yet history has its own ways of remembering. It preserves those who changed things, even when the change was subtle. It records the architects of shadows, the builders of systems that lasted beyond their time. And whether admired or feared, Darby Sabini shaped a world that continued to exist long after his hands no longer touched it. The truth is that stories like his rarely end cleanly. They stretch into the future, influencing decisions made by people who might never know his name. Every time a modern crime figure negotiates protection quietly rather than by force, every time a criminal enterprise uses respectability as a mask, a small part of Darby's legacy breathes again. That is how influence survives, not through fame, not through glory, but through the echoing patterns of behavior repeated by others. In a way, he still walks through London's past, not as a ghost haunting alleyways, but as an idea that refuses to die. And so, as this journey through his life comes to an end, one message quietly surfaces from the years he lived, the violence he witnessed, and the power he once held. Nothing in his world was simple. No one in that era remained untouched by the pressures of class, prejudice, survival, or ambition. And perhaps in the end, the story of Darby Sabini is not a lesson in crime, nor a celebration of danger, but a reminder of a truth London has always known, that greatness and darkness often grow from the same streets, shaped by the same hunger, guided by the same need to be seen and feared in equal measure. Long after the crowds have gone, after the racecourses have emptied, and the dust of history has settled over Little Italy, his name still drifts through London's memory like a whisper along old brick walls, quiet, watchful, perfectly polite,